I'm Maya, a 29-year-old event planner, and this story took place last year during what should have been the happiest time of my life. I'm sharing this because the revenge was so perfectly timed that it still gives me chills. I'd been living in my dream house for 2 years, a beautiful Victorian home I'd saved up for since college. The only problem was my next-door neighbor, Karen Mitchell, a 45-year-old woman who seemed to have made it her life's mission to make everyone around her miserable. Karen was the type of person who called the city about grass being half an inch too long, who complained about children playing in their own yards, and who had somehow gotten herself elected as the neighborhood HOA president despite everyone hating her. From the day I moved in, Karen had been a nightmare. She'd file noise complaints if I had friends over after 8 p.m. She'd measure my fence to make sure it was exactly regulation height, and she'd send passive-aggressive notes about my unsightly garden decorations. But Karen's hatred for me reached a new level when I got engaged to my fiancé David 8 months ago. She made several comments about young people these days getting married too quickly and how our engagement party was disrupting the neighborhood's peace. The real trouble started when I began planning my wedding. I'd hired a team to set up a beautiful outdoor ceremony in my backyard, completely legal, properly permitted, and scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Karen immediately launched a campaign to stop it. She filed complaints with the city, tried to get our permits revoked, and even started a petition among the neighbors to prevent commercial activities in residential areas. When all her official complaints failed, she got creative with her harassment. She'd blast music at 6 a.m. on weekends, park her car to block my driveway when vendors came by, and even called the police claiming I was operating an illegal business because I was planning my own wedding. But Karen's masterpiece of vindictiveness happened 3 days before my wedding. I woke up to the sound of water rushing and panicked screaming from David. Our entire basement was flooded with 3 feet of dirty water, destroying thousands of dollars worth of wedding supplies, gifts, and decorations I'd stored there. At first, I thought it was a plumbing disaster. Then I noticed the water was coming from the direction of Karen's house, flowing under our shared fence. I ran outside and discovered that Karen had deliberately redirected her sprinkler system to food my basement through a basement window she'd somehow managed to break. She was standing in her backyard, watching the destruction with a satisfied smirk on her face. "Oops," she said when she saw me. "Looks like you might need to postpone your little party." I was devastated. 3 days before my wedding, my basement was destroyed, my decorations were ruined, and I was looking at thousands of dollars in damages. But instead of crying or screaming, I did something that would change everything. I started documenting. I took photos of the flooding, the redirected sprinklers, the broken window, and Karen's smug expression. I'd also started recording our conversation on my phone. "You did this on purpose," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Prove it," she replied. "Accidents happen. Maybe you should have thought about that before planning your circus in a residential neighborhood." As I was recording, I noticed something strange in the background of her garage. It was open, and there were dozens of packages and boxes stacked in unusual patterns. While Karen was busy gloating about the flood damage, I kept my camera running and slowly moved to get a better angle of her garage. What I saw made my heart race. There were industrial-scale packages of what looked like drugs, scales, vacuum sealing equipment, and stacks of cash rubber banded together. Karen had been so focused on destroying my wedding that she'd forgotten to close her garage door while conducting what was obviously a major drug operation. I pretended to be distraught about the flood while secretly filming everything I could see in her garage. I captured images of the drugs, the money, the equipment, and even license plates of cars that were parked inside. "I hope you learned your lesson," Karen said, finally turning off her sprinklers. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about disturbing a peaceful neighborhood." I nodded and pretended to be defeated, all while getting the last few seconds of footage I needed. That night, instead of panicking about my wedding, I spent hours researching what I'd seen and building a case against Karen. The packages in her garage weren't just personal use drugs. This was clearly a distribution operation. I'd accidentally uncovered what looked like a major drug trafficking ring operating right next door to me. I also realized that Karen's erratic behavior and constant harassment might have been motivated by paranoia that I was getting too close to discovering her illegal activities. The next morning, I called the police and DEA with my evidence. I explained about the flood damage but focused mainly on the drug operation I discovered. We've been watching that address for months, the detective told me, but we haven't been able to get enough evidence for a search warrant. Your video might be exactly what we need. Within 6 hours, Karen's house was surrounded by law enforcement. They found over $500,000 worth of drugs, cash, and evidence of a trafficking network that had been operating for over 2 years. But it gets better. Karen wasn't working alone. Her husband Tom, her adult son Brandon, and even her elderly mother who lived with them were all involved in the operation. They'd been using their quiet suburban house as a front for distributing drugs throughout the entire region. All 4 family members were arrested simultaneously in a dramatic raid that the entire neighborhood watched from their windows. The local news covered the story, and I was interviewed as the alert citizen who'd helped bring down a major drug ring. They praised my civic responsibility and keen observation skills. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. While Karen was being processed at the county jail, I was getting married in my beautifully decorated backyard. The flood damage had been covered by insurance, and several neighbors had volunteered to help clean up and replace my decorations. The whole neighborhood had rallied around me after Karen's arrest. My wedding was absolutely perfect. The weather was ideal, the ceremony was beautiful, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that my vindictive neighbor was starting her weekend in a jail cell. But the revenge got even sweeter over the following months. The investigation revealed that Karen had been using her position as HOA president to monitor neighborhood activities and ensure no one got too close to discovering her operation. Her harassment of me and other neighbors had been a deliberate strategy to keep people afraid and isolated. Several neighbors came forward with stories of Karen's strange behavior, threats, and attempts to prevent them from having gatherings or improvements that might lead to increased scrutiny of her property. The entire drug operation was dismantled, and the family faced federal charges. Karen got 8 years in prison, her husband got 6, and their son got 4 years. Even the grandmother got house arrest for money laundering. Their house was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction. I bought it for 40% below market value and turned it into a rental property. The best part was that Karen had tried to flood my basement to prevent my wedding, but instead she'd accidentally revealed her illegal operation and ensured that I'd never have to deal with her again. I also received a reward from the DEA for providing the evidence that led to the drug bust. The money more than covered our wedding costs and honeymoon. The neighborhood completely transformed after Karen's arrest. Property values went up. People started having block parties again, and the new HOA president actually cares about making the community better instead of terrorizing everyone. I ran into Karen's public defender a few months later, and he told me that Karen was still convinced I'd been spying on her for months, and that the flood was just a convenient excuse for my surveillance operation. She couldn't accept that her own vindictive behavior had led to her downfall. She thought I was some kind of mastermind who'd orchestrated her arrest, when really she'd just been incredibly stupid and unlucky. The irony is that if Karen had just left me alone, I never would have been in a position to discover her drug operation. Her obsession with ruining my life is what ultimately destroyed her own. Today, I'm happily married, living in my dream house, and earning rental income from Karen's former property. The neighborhood is peaceful, friendly, and free from the toxic influence that had been poisoning it for years. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if Karen had just been a normal neighbor who minded her own business. But then I remember that her drug operation was destroying lives throughout our community, and I'm glad I was able to help stop it. The moral of the story: sometimes the best revenge is just letting terrible people destroy themselves while you document everything. Karen's hatred for me blinded her to the consequences of her own actions. 2 years later, I'm now known as the neighborhood hero who helped clean up our community. Karen is still in federal prison, probably wondering how her plan to ruin my wedding ended up ruining her entire life instead.